Hey everyone, welcome to Echoes of Time. And guess what? We're kicking off a brand new podcast series right here on the channel. Each episode, we're diving into stories, ideas, and conversations that prove the past is never really gone. It still shapes who we are today. So if you're ready for powerful insights, engaging talks, and a fresh perspective every week, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're always here when the next episode drops. All right, let's get started. This is Echoes of Time, the podcast series.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're focusing on a really critical issue, the sustained high-altitude military standoff between India and China, specifically along the line of actual control, the LAC, in the vast and unforgiving terrain of Ladakh. It's critical because the escalation back in 2020, it really fundamentally reshaped how these two, nuclear powers interact. The tragic Galwan Valley clash that marked the first combat fatalities on that border in nearly 50 years. And it signaled a massive step change, a change that moved the frontier from, let's say, strategic ambiguity to persistent military confrontation.
Right. And the sheer length of this confrontation, it really demands we look beyond just the immediate headlines, the troop movements, and focus on the lasting injury this standoff is actually inflicting. While the world, quite rightly, focuses on the dangers, the inherent dangers in a geopolitical dispute between two giants like these, the crisis itself it's deeply bifurcated.
Precisely. And that brings us right to the central question we need to grapple with today. What is the most profound, the most critical long-term crisis that's been generated by this Ladakh standoff? Is it the sustained geopolitical threat, the military instability between two nuclear powers ensuring this permanent volatility? Or is it the acute and potentially irreversible sociocultural and economic disruption happening to the, frankly, fragile local communities of Ladakh?
I believe, and I feel quite strongly about this, that when you're measuring the long-term impact, the focus really must shift entirely to the irrevocable crisis facing the inhabitants on the ground. The loss of livelihood, the existential threat to their traditional culture, and, importantly, the resulting internal political destabilization. I think these are the most profound and lasting consequences of this border conflict.
And I have to argue the opposite side. While the local suffering is, it's undeniable, it's tragic, the security crisis itself, the deep political antagonism, the permanent large-scale militarization of the LAC, I think that constitutes the most critical long-term threat. It dominates everything else, including the local impact, which fundamentally is derivative of the bigger geopolitical problem. The reason the security crisis takes precedence for me is the fundamental and what seems like a permanent shift in the bilateral relationship. China's actions in 2020, they were viewed by India not just as, simple encroachment, but as a deliberate and profound breach, a breach of all existing long-standing border management protocols. And this, it shattered decades of really fragile cooperation and trust.
The result is plain to see. The LAC, which was traditionally a sparsely manned frontier, where patrolling was governed by agreed-upon limits, it's been irreversibly transformed. We are now seeing the permanent deployment of tens of thousands of specialized high-altitude troops, supported by heavy armor, missile systems, artillery, right across key friction points like Pangongso, Gograh Hot Springs, Dapsang, and Demchok. This ensures permanent, high-cost volatility between two nuclear powers, and it diverts immense defense resources that, frankly, could otherwise be fueling their massive economic ambitions.
Okay. I see the gravity of that strategic tension. I really do. But I view the depth of the crisis through a different lens, and that's the Changpuk Reunity. For me, the most severe long-term crisis is the existential threat posed to the nomadic herders of Ladakh. Their entire way of life, which they've sustained for centuries, it's based entirely on accessing these vast, high-altitude pastures. Now, the new military presence, combined with the creation of these mandatory buffer zones And this is even in areas where there's been partial disengagement, like Golan. It has permanently cut off access to vital grazing land. This directly threatens the economy built around the famed Pashmina Wall, which absolutely requires these specific high-altitude conditions and grazing routes. What we're witnessing now is distress migration, herders moving to urban centers like Leh. When military security measures actively, facilitate the cultural disappearance of the very people they are ostensibly meant to protect, well, that, to me, is the most profound failure.
I won't dismiss the tragedy of cultural loss, of course not, but we have to frame the potential risks strategically. The core border dispute, the claims over Aksai Chin, the eastern claims in Arunachal Pradesh, that remains entirely unresolved. The military deployments, the Galwan clash, these were really just the physical symptoms of this underlying, profound strategic tension. In this kind of rupture, it fundamentally shatters the delicate peace framework that existed, however flawed it was. More critically, the permanent deployment of these specialized forces guarantees that the area will remain a flashpoint, prone to future unpredictable escalation, which carries risks far, far beyond any local economic distress. When we talk about global stability, the potential for miscalculation between two nuclear states in this environment, that's the ultimate crisis.
Wow. And this is where the specifics of the conflict become so crucial. Look at the unresolved friction points like Depsang. It's strategically vital, we know that, because of its proximity to the Dolak Big Oldie airstrip, the DBO airstrip, and the Karakoram Pass. Now, the military's response there, and in other areas too, has involved restricting access to traditional areas. Areas like the Yai Junction, where Changpa herders historically accessed absolutely key grazing grounds. Any eventual agreement, like the one discussed in late 2024, it only aims to restore the military patrolling status that existed pre-2020. That doesn't undo the loss of the pastures that have already been converted into restricted military buffer zones. The economic and cultural infrastructure of the Changpas has been wounded, deeply wounded in a way that simply cannot be reversed just by shifting a few military tents around.
Okay, I appreciate the point about the localized, irreversible impact, I do. But the very fact that we even had the late 2024 agreement, however limited its scope might have been, it points back to the paramount importance of the diplomatic dimension, doesn't it? The deep trust deficit, stemming from this feeling that China breached core protocols. It makes every single future agreement inherently fragile, difficult to negotiate, difficult to maintain. The diplomatic damage itself confirms the permanence of this new militarized reality. And the constant diversion of defense resources, which you mentioned earlier, that is a crisis of grand strategic scale. Maintaining specialized infrastructure at 14,000 feet, securing supply lines, constantly upgrading military readiness, that represents billions in continuous, non-productive military spending for both nations. That kind of financial and strategic drain, it fundamentally alters both countries' long-term regional aspirations.
That's a powerful articulation of the strategic cost, yes. But let me reframe the damage slightly by looking internally. Have you considered the acute political consequences that are being fueled directly by this militarization? The restrictions imposed by the military, the loss of pasture access, the resulting distress migration, these are driving internal political tensions that are destabilizing the region from within. Local groups in Ladakh, they're not just asking for aid, they are demanding statehood and constitutional safeguards, specifically inclusion in the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution.
I know. The demands are escalating, yes, but how does an internal political reform demand equate to a crisis on the scale of nuclear flashpoints?
Well, it equates because the 6th schedule is not just some minor administrative fix. If granted, it would give the local inhabitants autonomous governance powers over land, resource management, social customs. In essence, it's designed to be a shield against arbitrary land acquisition or, crucially, military restriction of pastures. The very fact that the local population feels compelled to seek constitutional protection against the security forces, the forces that are meant to defend them, that highlights just how critically the crisis has metastasized beyond the border itself. The military standoff has, somewhat ironically, destabilized the internal political structure of the very territory it seeks to secure.
I find that line of reasoning compelling.
certainly on a domestic political level, but I'm not convinced that internal tensions, however severe they might be, truly supersede the fundamental geopolitical rupture. The ultimate cause, the root cause of all these issues, is the failure to properly demarcate the boundary lines inherited from the colonial era and the unresolved territorial claims solidified by the 1962 Sino-Indian War. The geopolitical standoff defines the crisis. Local suffering, while deeply tragic, is an inevitable consequence, I would argue, of that primary external conflict. Focusing on the strategic rivalry is necessary because only a resolution to the Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh claims can ultimately remove the pressure that leads to these restrictions on the Changpas.
I would argue differently. When the core purpose of a boundary conflict is ostensibly to secure a territory, and the direct immediate result is the irreversible destruction of the existing society that depends entirely on that very territory, I'm talking about the loss of the nomadic Changpa culture, then the societal collapse itself becomes the defining failure of the conflict. It's no longer just a tragic side effect. The distress migration we're seeing proves that the crisis has moved beyond simple security concerns about lines on a map. You simply cannot declare a successful defense of the region if that defense entails destroying the cultural and economic foundations of the land you've supposedly secured. The permanent nature of cultural loss, for me, fundamentally shifts the calculus of which crisis is most critical in the long term.
So, to summarize my position, the permanent militarization of the LAC, the shattering of these long-standing border management protocols, this constitutes the paramount crisis. The continued deployment of vast specialized resources, the immense strategic risk posed by two nuclear-armed powers in continuous high-altitude antagonism, this presents a danger that has broad regional and frankly global consequences, dwarfing, in my view, the local issues, however serious they are.
And I maintain that the threat of cultural loss, the disruption of the traditional nomadic life of the Changpas, specifically due to the loss of access to those critical high-altitude grazing grounds, and the resulting internal political instability, which is evidenced by the urgent demand for constitutional safeguards like the Sixth Schedule, this represents an immediate, irreversible, and therefore the most critical long-term crisis arising from this conflict. The erosion of identity and livelihood is, I believe, a permanent failure of the entire security framework in this context.
Well, the complexity of the Ladakh situation clearly requires understanding both aspects, the high-stakes geopolitical maneuvers driving international tension and the profound local human impact that results directly from those maneuvers.
Exactly. And recognizing that even as the strategic players seek resolutions like the partial disengagement achieved through those late 2024 agreements, those military solutions don't inherently or automatically translate into a resolution for the communities. The communities whose ancestral land access has already been restricted and potentially lost forever. The core long-term issues impacting both the geopolitical sphere and the human sphere, they remain profoundly unresolved.
And that brings us to the end of today's podcast session on Echoes of Time. Every story, every thought is a reminder that the past always finds its way into the present. If this episode spoke to you, don't just stop here. Hit that like button, share it with someone who'd love it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an echo of history, ideas, and reflections. Turn on the notification bell too, because each week we're diving deeper, and you'll want to be part of the conversation as it unfolds. Thanks for spending your time with us. Until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and remember, every moment carries an echo of time.